When you were studying this stuff, like, was accessibility even mentioned beyond, like, maybe a passing term in education? Or
Not even a passing term, I'd say. Like, it just wasn't brought up at all. In graphic design, there's no discussion around accessible design. The social model of disability is teaching us that there are barriers, and as designers, we need to be careful that we're not bringing those barriers into the work ourselves.
For us, accessibility is around ensuring that individuals in a variety of different situations with a variety of different impairments are able to access, understand and interact with the content that's being provided to them. The real limitations for a lot of our clients comes from that they're tied into services that they've got long-term contracts with and that they can't get out of until there's a new renewal date or something like that. We're trying to help them along that journey to find out how they can manage those challenges as they go through the process. It's those inclusive design principles that can be used as almost a checklist just of thoughts like, have I thought about this in my process? It can be at the end of, before you submit a design, you can just look through them and be like, have I thought about all these things? Does that meet all of these requirements or not? And if not, maybe I need to make a couple of changes and things like that.
Certainly before I send anything off, I usually have to have a minute's stare at whatever I'm doing. I have to just stare at the screen blankly for just 1 minute and just really focus on it and go, right, is that typeface accessible? Are all of the colours accessible?
You do it at the kind of multiple different zooms as well. Like you zoom right out and then you're like, does that still all make sense? Yep, okay, zoom in. Yep, that makes sense as well.
Hello, I am Luke, the designer at Purple Goat Agency, and this is the Purple Goat Podcast. Today I am joined with a guest. This is Will. Will works for a company called Zoonou. And Will, would you like to start off by introducing yourself and what Zoonou is and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So I'm William. I'm the head of accessibility at Zoonou. So I am responsible for a testing team of testers that solely focus on testing the accessibility of websites, mobile applications, and a variety of other different kind of digital surfaces. Zoonou's been around for, I think it's 15 years now. And as a business, we offer a variety of different testing services, with accessibility being one of the specialisms that we offer alongside things like penetration load and standard functional testing.
Oh, excellent. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you onto the podcast today, was because you and I, we share an interest in accessibility.
Yep.
But what's quite interesting is we do it from very different angles.
Absolutely.
So you do it from a very digital perspective, very much from the perspective of, correct me if I'm wrong, but as you said, websites, applications, looking at comparing things against the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG as it's often shortened to. Whereas quite often what I'm doing is I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah.
And in graphic design, there's no discussion around accessible design. Things like WCAG don't exist.
Yep.
And so part of what I do in my work is I look to bring across some of those things from the accessibility guidelines and bring them into graphic design to start a conversation there, because it's important there as well. It's just one that is not being had.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I thought a great way to start would be perhaps you could give us a definition from your perspective in the work, from what you do, on accessibility and inclusive design and what those things mean to you.
Within Zoonou, we operate mainly focusing on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but that isn't solely a definition of what accessibility is. For us, accessibility is around ensuring that individuals in a variety of different situations with a variety of different impairments are able to access, understand and interact with the content that's being provided to them. So whether that's they are completing something like a tax submission on a government website, or whether they're ordering a pizza on their mobile phone on a mobile app, we want to ensure that that experience is consistent across the board. What about for yourself? Like, how do you define it in your work?
Yeah, so I think one thing I wanted to pick up on that you said there that was quite good was that you said that WCAG is involved in what you do, but it doesn't define what you do. It's a tool. It's an aid. It's a form of legislation in a way.
Yep.
And it's and I think that's really good, because when I think of accessibility and inclusive design as well, it also doesn't define what I do.
Yep.
So I would say, from my perspective, when I look at inclusive design and accessibility, I quite often refer back to the social model of disability, which is the idea that people in society are disabled by barriers caused by society rather than individuals having a disability and all of the problems coming from within themselves.
Yep.
And for what I do in particular in terms of inclusive design and accessibility, for me, I bring that across to my definition in that the social model of disability is teaching us that there are barriers, and as designers, we need to be careful that we're not bringing those barriers into the work ourselves. So for me, inclusive design is mindful practice of ensuring that as a designer, I'm not doing anything that would limit someone from being able to interact with the content that I put out or the things that I make.
I totally agree with that. I think when it comes to the type of work that we're working in, the social model is very much the definition of accessibility, of disability, that echoes most with the focuses and the things we're trying to achieve, because we are trying to prevent those barriers from being made. We're not trying to turn around and say this is something that lies in someone and therefore they need a treatment in order for them to be able to access something. It's just, this should be something that we provide for everyone.
And to finish off that point, I think for me that one thing I like in particular about WCAG is the way that it comes down to the 4 main words that are used. And I know that as a graphic designer, I'm quite focused on the word on the main principle of perceivable.
Yep.
The graphics that because I'm dealing with things that are quite often 2D digital surfaces. In terms of output, they don't really have any sort of function that you can't click on them and interact with them. The interaction comes from viewing them or spectating them a lot of the time.
Yep.
The perceivable is really, for me, quite an important thing. One question for you, Will, about the way that you practice and the way that at Zoonou you work with inclusive design and accessibility. In terms of websites and analysis, do you think that these accessibility criterion in any way limit the way that people go about websites, or do you think that there are things like that? Do you think there are limitations which make things harder, and can these be overcome?
From the guidelines, I don't think there's hugely limitations there. I think a lot of what the guidelines are asking often is to meet recognized standards like the HTML standard, for people to be considerate of how they're building things. Often, I'd say we're very lucky in the sense that most of the clients that we work with are bought into accessibility when they're working with us. So there's never too much of a pushback in that there being a change that needs to be made that they're unhappy with. But what we can do in those situations is we'll try and work with them if there is something they're unsure about to help them find the best way of supporting that. And sometimes it's the real limitations for a lot of our clients comes from that they're tied into services that they've got long-term contracts with and that they can't get out of until there's a new renewal date or something like that. So say they're tied in with, and this is probably a slightly bad example, but say they're tied in with a payment provider. If that payment provider isn't providing an accessible service, that it's until their next renewal with that payment provider that they can tackle that, because they can't just switch payment provider. Well, they probably can, but there's a large cost issue for them. So they want to make sure that they finish that term of their contract first before then moving into the next one.
Oh, that's really interesting. I wouldn't have even thought of that before, about that idea of the way that different companies' accessibility interact with each other in providing a holistic service. That's really quite
so
interesting.
We see kind of lots of kind of individual things, like you get things that people are using as plugins. So also get things like all of the kind of cookie notice providers and things like that. Of course, like most of those are third-party providers. So you have like your OneTrusts and things like that. And those, again, people are potentially tied into. It could maybe just be a 6-month contract or a 1-month contract, or it might be something they have for free. If it's free, it might be easier for them to replace and switch something else in than if it's something that it's paid for. Equally, if it's something that's free and they are then looking to switch something else in and the only accessible version is a paid for option, they might have to wait till their next budgetary year in order to be able to afford that and account for that within their costs. So we're trying to help them along that journey to find out how they can manage those challenges as they go through the process.
Wow.
What about on your side though? Like, where do you find the kind of challenges or limitations with it?
I think from my perspective, a lot of the limitations and the challenges come through the lack of education and clarity with inclusive design within the industry. So one thing that I always like to say is, for me personally, looking at things from a graphic design perspective, I think a lot of the reason why it's not considered is that there is no education around it. Designers aren't even taught in the beginning about even the basic things such as color contrast, accessible typefaces, etc.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I don't know what your kind of educational background is, but when you were studying this stuff, like, was accessibility even mentioned beyond like maybe a passing term in education? Or
not even a passing term, I'd say. Like, it just wasn't brought up at all.
Yeah,
these things. I think for me, the reason why I became interested in it and how I started to learn about it was off of my own back.
Yep.
There were no resources out there. The education system wasn't teaching about it. The only reason I learned about it was because I was always involved in working with the disabled community.
Yep.
And through that, I was just starting to make considerations in my own head about disabled people and how they'd interact with the graphics. I started to ask questions like, how does this interact? Like, how does this interact? How could someone from the deaf community interact with this? How could a visually impaired person interact with X, Y, and Z? And so through those questions, I started to look into the answers and find that actually the sources with those answers were quite niche and quite small. Yep. They existed, but they weren't out there. And so I think for me, a lot of that challenge is through that communication or lack of, especially when it comes, because a lot of the way that I try and set up the basis for my practice is using WCAG as a basic guideline. But then WCAG doesn't cover a lot of things, like it doesn't cover everything for me.
No.
And it's different. I think one of the main things between what you and I do is you do web-based things, which might be classed under IT as a discipline, whereas at the most macro level, what I do would be considered art or visual culture. And those different disciplines are going to have different priorities innately. And so that means that when I want to do something accessibly, sometimes I can't do it in the most obvious way or the most taught way.
Yep.
I have to challenge some of the conventional teaching.
Yep.
Because the conventional teaching is, you know, the best way to produce an advert or a social media graphic in this situation is to do X, Y, and Z. But that might not be very accessible.
Yep.
And so that's why lack of clarity can be a big challenge for me. But overall, I would say that through having these conversations, it helps reduce the challenges and the limitations. And the other thing I'd say as well is I think some excellent examples of branding out there have shown us that you can have amazing graphics without the limitations. So you could, like, I like to think of examples such as, you know, the Nike logo, for example. If you think of it as the most overarching form of the brand, we have what is quite often a sans serif typeface with a quite simple mark placed as usually a black color against a white background or a white color against a black background. There's no additional things there. There's nothing that would cause additional accessibility issues from the get-go. But it's widely recognized and people like it.
Yep.
And so to me, examples like that prove that we can move towards accessible graphic design past the limitations.
With the challenges that you're talking about, have you experienced anything where you've been working with specific brands and they've got colors or iconography that isn't accessible, and how have you had to deal with that in those scenarios?
So you're completely right. Like, there are a lot of brands out there don't have accessible and inclusive graphics, and that is a reality of the situation for a number of different reasons. And it causes quite a lot of problems because I want to always do something in the most accessible and inclusive way, but sometimes a brand has pre-established guidelines. They have pre-established things that they want to keep to as well. And that can throw up some issues sometimes. It depends really on what the outcome is going to be. There are times, unfortunately, where we can't interact too much with their brand guidelines, and that is a shame. However, there are ways that we compromise it. And usually when it comes to those sorts of times, it's usually things such as pitching or more internal things.
Yep.
We can ask ahead to the people that we're going to be on a call with if we're preparing something in their branding, and we can ask if they need anything in alternative formats, if they need any sort of accessibility adjustments and things like that. And so that way the audience is much smaller and we can cater for specific people in mind. However, there are times as well when we're doing something that might be public facing,
Yep.
or something that's going to be seen by the wider disabled community. And that is when I think we do have to put our foot down a bit more and say, look, these things do need to be accessible to everyone, and this is how we need to do it. It's not about saying that people are wrong or that things need to be removed, but it's about, again, compromising. Is it the fact that is the inaccessible element that's causing the hold up that they are a yellow base, they use yellow a lot and they're putting white text on their yellow brand color? Well, in that case, we can switch it to black and usually there's not too much of a problem there.
Yep.
If it's a much more developed brand system, something with a lot more assets and things going on, it might be that we focus in on something that is accessible, because it's very rare that everything is inaccessible in a brand. So it might be that if there are elements, individual elements that are quite accessible, we can take those few elements and really maximize those and say, right, well, this asset that we're making that's going to go out and be seen by a wide audience, we're going to take that asset and we're going to focus in on this bit of your branding so that it's accessible, and then people will also recognize it back to their brand, and that works. So that's really, I think, the main way that we go about it. Is it's really about who's seeing it and who is going to be interpreting it and what are their accessibility needs.
And in those situations, do you make suggestions to the client? So do you say to them, okay, we're creating this asset for you, we're going to use these colors because we know that these ones work together that are accessible? Or do you have scenarios where also you might say, we know your main brand color is orange, for instance, but the current tone of it isn't quite right, we're going to use a slightly darker orange and use it for these reasons and present that to them as an option?
Yeah, so a lot of the time it is about education as well.
Yeah.
So education comes and plays a big part into what we do when we work with brands, especially when we're making assets for them. And as you say, sometimes it might be that we look to, because the other good thing is a lot of the time is brands these days, especially ones who work with brand guidelines and fleshed out documents of things, they usually have quite a few tones. And it might be almost as you're saying, we might look at those brand guidelines and go, right, there's that tone. It's not the primary tone, but they have this secondary tone that is accessible with black text, and that's what we need in this situation. So we're going to use that one. The other thing as well is sometimes we do projects where we're setting up a brand for a client. So we've done assets from scratch for clients. And in those cases, one of the things that I really like doing when working on those projects is being able to practice what I preach and put accessible and inclusive graphic design right from the real grassroots and the ground of the brand. So making sure before we've even started anything that the colors have adequate color contrast, that their main typeface is accessible. And then that means that if they want to work with us in future or anyone else, it means that all of their primary assets are going to be accessible. To you as well. Do you have any sort of challenges when working with clients? I know you touched on it a little bit already about that holistic system. Are there any other sorts of things as well that you can think of?
So I think we experience kind of similar things to what you were talking about. We have had scenarios where clients' brand colors are not accessible, and this is because we're talking about then websites that are potentially their main websites and things like that. We're actually then at the point of these are your main brand colors. And in those scenarios, it again comes back to that idea that most of our clients already bought into what we're talking about, and we're lucky to be able to then work with them and then say, okay, let's try and change this color. Let's work with you to find a color that works. Often it's a very quick conversation because a designer, someone like yourself, will look at it and go, okay, how about this one that's a little bit darker? Does that work? And we'll look at it and be like, yeah, that'll work with large text. That'll work with small text. That'll be absolutely fine in these scenarios. So yeah, we've had a couple of examples like that where colors have changed a little bit over the development of their website. Sometimes it's over multiple different years where they've slowly introduced slightly darker colors in different areas of the site. That can be with businesses that are large international businesses where they have a lot of web real estate. So it takes them a while to actually change those colors across the platforms. But yeah, we've worked with a kind of couple of different scenarios in that, and it's always been pretty successful. I think kind of where we're sat being more of a testing business, we're always just giving them the feedback and saying this is what needs to be changed. Right. And because of that, we can be quite hard line on it. Something is either going to pass or it's going to fail when we check it again. So as long as we're identifying this is a high severity, a medium severity, or nice to have, we can do that. And that's one of the nice things about, we have the guidelines, but we also have recommendations, we have best practices and things like that we can test against, and we can say you need to be having headings that are not jumping in order, that they're logically nested and things like that. Technically, that doesn't fall properly into the web content accessibility guidelines. It's a fantastic thing to do. It's really important for screen reader users, but we can present that to a client still as being quite a kind of high severity issue for them to get sorted out, because we also know from a principle of the amount of time that's going to be required to fix this versus the impact that it's going to have. It's quite low effort versus high impact.
And I think, just to bring back to a point you mentioned there quite early on in what you were saying there, the conversation. Like usually with a lot of what both of us are doing, I think one similarity is a lot of it can be resolved with a conversation.
Yeah.
And as you said, the businesses that you work with are quite bought into accessibility. They're from the get-go, so usually having those conversations can be a little bit easier. The people who come to us are also bought into accessibility, and quite often that conversation can be great at fixing the things that might be a problematic, and reaching resolutions as well and overcoming challenges, as you say.
Yeah, honestly, it's one of the most important parts of what we do, I think, is, I mean, it'll kind of maybe differ to your process. In our kind of process, once we finish testing, we then schedule calls with our clients to then talk about these are the issues raised. Which ones do you think are going to be difficult? Why do you think they're going to be difficult? How can we support you with that? What additional information do you need? And I imagine kind of on the same way for you, you're creating a design and then going, how's this? What works for you? What doesn't work for you? Oh yeah, we've done this way because of it needs to be accessible for this reason and things like that. So you're presenting information to them via conversation. They're learning in the process as well and understanding why these changes are being made or why these decisions are being made, rather than just looking at it and being like, okay, that's fine, and just carrying on. It goes back to what you're saying about there's not education necessarily easily available, but what we provide in the way we manage our services or way we interact with people is we are helping people to learn about accessibility and learn about inclusive design.
Yeah, and it's going back to what we were saying, as you said about, we've both said now, education. It really is amazing how when you can just break down, like a lot of these concepts, I think when you say to someone the term inclusive design or accessibility, people see it as this complex thing that they don't know about, and how can they know about it? Are they going to have to go on a course for it and all of this? Well, no, actually, when you boil it down to, some of those basic concepts, some of them are things that you can implement right away, and there are things that you're familiar with and that you know about.
Yeah, they're also their thinking points as well, which is the nice thing, especially with the more inclusive design side. If you look at the principles of inclusive design, you've got things like be consistent. That's the thing that you can think about as you're creating designs. Is my headings on the page, or are my headings consistent? Is my navigation always in the same place? Is the help on the page always in a place that's easy to find? They aren't necessarily things that are too granular. Yes, with the web content accessibility guidelines, you can get really granular into specifics and things like that. But there's a really nice overview that you can get first that you can just think about.
Yeah, and I think for us as I think for graphic designers, that's definitely something that we can get better at. When I think about, how the mainstream graphic design process is on a lot of things, a lot of things come down to because it looks nice, without, there might not be much thought beyond that. And when it comes to things like colors or typefaces, we really need to like have an extra level of thought, almost what you were saying there was like having a conscious level of thought about why we're doing things, having actual justification, reasons that are objective as to why we're doing things. I almost say it's like in the past, 100 years or so ago, graphic designers would have had to have been very conscious about their choices based on limitations to do with tools and processes. And so everything was a thought. But we live in a world now where with amazing technology, we can do anything we want at any time. We can do it quickly without much thought.
Yeah.
But we need to have some of that thought back into the process, I think, sometimes. Sometimes we move a bit too fast and we do things a bit too quickly. Inclusive design, to me, is a part of that thought that needs to go into it that's often overlooked.
Absolutely. And I think where you're saying around designers thinking about what they're doing, or kind of anyone that's creating content thinking about what they're doing, it's those inclusive design principles that can be used as almost a checklist just of thoughts like, have I thought about this in my process? It can be at the end of, before you submit a design, you can just look through them and be like, have I thought about all these things? Does that meet all of these requirements or not? And if not, maybe I need to make a couple of changes and things like that.
Oh, yeah, it's like certainly before I send anything off, I usually have to have a minute stare at whatever I'm doing. I have to just stare at the screen blankly for just 1 minute and just really focus on it and go, right, is that typeface accessible? Are all of the colors accessible?
Do you do it at the kind of multiple different zooms as well? Like you zoom right out and then you're like, does that still all make sense? Yep, okay, zoom in. Yep, that makes sense as well.
For clients that you work with or people looking to practice inclusive design from the way that you do things, do you think there's a barrier to entry for clients at all, or people trying to learn these sorts of things for themselves?
In some ways, yeah. But I think the barrier to entry is often time, in the sense that the environments that most people are working in are very busy. They don't necessarily afford them the amount of time to then take training or learn and read about accessibility and get the knowledge base that they need. I don't necessarily think I think there's, with having access to the internet, there's so much information out there that people can get to. And we are fortunate to have things like web content accessibility guidelines, inclusive design principles, loads of other bits of literature around accessibility from experts in the field, people's own blogs and things like that. The information's there, but having the time when you're a project manager to then go and look at all these things when you've got deadlines for getting a website out the door, or you've got stakeholders that are wanting something else done, is really the biggest challenge, I think. I think there's a lot of people that want to do it, but the barrier for them is necessarily having that support from the business to be able to do it in a way that they are learning enough. Because I think to become someone that's going to understand accessibility at the level that you're talking about, that I'm talking about in the work that you're doing, it takes a while. You can't just learn it overnight. And we do training with people, and one of the key things that I try and emphasize in that is that I don't expect you to leave this training session being an accessibility expert at the end of it. I don't expect you to turn around and be like, right, we're going to start building everything accessibly from tomorrow. You want to find small wins that you can start off with, the small changes that you can make, and then build upon that. Maybe for a couple of months, that means that all you're focusing on is ensuring that you're using your alt tags correctly, ensuring that you've got captions on your videos, and maybe that all of your heading structure is correct. Later on down the line, you then might start looking at your error messaging and the way that notifies users when those errors alert and things like that. So it can be a long process. And that is one of the challenges, especially with the testing side, is that we're coming in and saying, here's 30 issues, here's 40 issues. You need to go off and fix them now. If we didn't have that midpoint of talking to them and saying, what issues do you have challenges with and things like that, people would just be left on their own and then find it really difficult. So they need that time kind of blocked out for them to have that support and think about how they can get to understanding accessibility. What do you think? Do you think there's barriers?
Yeah, I think there are barriers. Like, that is one thing that I feel quite passionately about, actually, is the barriers to inclusive graphic design. And I think the one that I always focus on in terms of my practice is time. As you say, time is always an enemy that stops us from, being able to make all of the decisions that we want sometimes. I also think, personally, from a graphic design perspective, one that I'm quite passionate about is cost as well.
Yep.
I think one of the big differences between perhaps with websites and things and with graphic design is, with websites, from my experience, it's easier than ever to make a website cheaply.
Yep.
Whereas I think with graphic design, a lot of what we do is centralized around the Adobe Suite.
Yep.
It has a big monopoly over the work that we do. But fortunately, there are competitors out there who are mirroring things like Photoshop and Illustrator and giving people alternatives and really affordable ways to get engaged with that kind of software. But the problem I find is that Photoshop and Illustrator aren't teaching people about inclusive graphic design.
Yeah.
And so the one or two Adobe programs that do, InDesign, Acrobat Pro,
Yep.
are paywalled.
Yep.
If someone wants to learn, how to be an inclusive graphic designer, it's very hard just for the fact that there's a huge monetary cost there. Like,
Yeah.
I always, I'm quite lucky in that if I want to make an accessible PDF, I have access to tools that will let me do that and will let me do that easily. But not a lot of people have those tools. And one thing I would love to see moving forward is greater access to accessibility features within free or low-cost versions of graphic design tools, because I think that could be a real benefit. And I'm really looking, I think one of the next really amazing things that could come along in terms of my industry is that idea of having something really, really affordable that really gets people engaged, and people who might feel not quite confident with accessible, something that can guide people and be very intuitive and easy, because that's the other thing as well. InDesign and Acrobat can sometimes be very unintuitive, especially with their accessible design tools. So I guess one other question, William, to think about as well is red flags as well when it comes to inclusive design and accessibility from your end. Are there things that you think are immediate red flags when it comes to these sorts of things?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting things that I spot when kind of scoping potential projects around accessibility. This could be if I'm looking at a website that's got lots of graphs on it or tables and things like that. Immediately I'm like, there's loads of risks here with the way the information's presented, how these tables built. Are any of these graphs actually accessible? If these graphs have got hover states on them, so like where you mouse over a section of the graph and it tells you the number that it is, like, is the table also available for the user to access that information? Like, so many kind of red flags with things like that. But even just kind of cursory checks, so if it's a website that I've not been to before, I'll normally find myself tabbing my way around it using the keyboard, and immediately if there's no focus indicator, if the focus order isn't logical, they're kind of like little red flags of like, okay, this could be a big issue one, or kind of might be something to be concerned about. The other one that's more interesting, though, that I think can be a red flag is when you see accessibility statements on websites that refer to older guidelines or refer to older technologies. So some accessibility statements will say how to access some of the accessibility features within your browser, and it might reference browsers that don't exist anymore. It might say something like Netscape or AOL or something like that. And then you're very much like, okay, so your accessibility statement hasn't been updated for X number of years. That may also mean your accessibility hasn't been considered for X number of years as well. You can kind of do the same with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines with 2.0 and 2.1, but with the guidelines, they do stand on their own as well. You can still, to this day, decide that you only want to meet the 2.0 guidelines, and that's perfectly fine. So I wouldn't necessarily say if I went to a website that said we're meeting Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 level AA, I'd be as concerned as if I saw something like, here's how to change your accessibility settings in Internet Explorer 8, like much more kind of red flag. Even if it says Internet Explorer in these days, I'd probably still see that as a bit of a red flag.
Yeah, no, that's very fair. I think from my perspective of things, like when I think of the idea of red flags, I think for me, red flags are always a tricky one with graphic design, because as we established quite early on, very different disciplines.
Yep.
So the difference between things being IT and art, I think, creates a real problem there. And I think, like, for me to identify things as red flags, because sometimes I think, okay, hopefully there is a graphic designer or an artist's intention behind what's doing.
Yep.
And before making instant judgments, sometimes I think I have to almost take a step back and look at things, just because of the fact that it's so subjective in what I'm in my discipline with visual visual culture and art. There's so much interpretation and things going on that sometimes it's really hard to make instant accessibility calls. And there are, and saying that, I do look at things with my accessibility hat on and my inclusive design hat, and from the get-go I go, right, that's not accessible, that's not inclusive. But at the same time, I think it's hard for me sometimes to really, because as I've said, there's such a lack of clarity and things aren't always so black and white in inclusive design when it comes to artistic things. It can become quite murky when it comes to balancing that idea of intention versus accessibility in such a subjective discipline. In terms of your sides of things, what do you think you would like to see in the future for accessible and inclusive design going forward, especially as there's so many technologies advancing these days, and we need to keep making sure that those are accessible and inclusive as well. So what would you like to see?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that I'd like to see is actually just better web accessibility. Even now, I can't remember how long ago it was, but there's a charity called WebAIM that do a annual survey of the top 100 websites and how many of their front pages are accessible, and it's well over 50% that are failing still. And these are big recognizable businesses that still aren't getting it right, and it shouldn't be that difficult, and we need the industry leaders to also be delivering that. We need people to be able to access content regardless of what business they're dealing with. So I think that's kind of one of the key things that I like. Technology-wise, I think things are going to be really interesting in the next few years. We're going to see a bit more of a growth of things like AI. How's accessibility going to work with AI? We're going to see probably, I'd expect a little bit more stuff around augmented reality and virtual reality stuff potentially. How is accessibility going to work with that? I know there are people that are looking at that at the moment. We've done a bit of research ourselves on it, but there's no recognised standards, I don't think, yet for it. And without standards, you can't have a consistent level of this is going to work for this tool and this tool and this tool, as well as be something that considers all those kind of accessibility considerations that aren't around ensuring tools work, that are more around like perception and things like that.
Yeah. That's all of those things, those emerging technologies are really interesting, especially like I know AI is one that a few people at Purple Go are quite interested in, and how that impacts with the disabled community in the various ways. So that's going to be a very interesting conversation moving forward. Things like, as you touched on there, VR as well, like from a graphic designer perspective, like there's a whole different set of rules out there when it comes to things like 3D and ensuring that VR is accessible, making sure that lights aren't too overwhelming, making sure that you're avoiding motion sickness and things like that. It's a whole another group of things that we need to be aware of and that need to be brought into the attention.
Yeah, and I think one of the nice things, or one of the potentially interesting things about AI, and this potentially could be a little controversial, is that, and by all means we're nowhere near this yet, AI can be used to provide meaningful tools for accessibility as well. If we can get to the point where AI is actually capable of doing it, I've not seen any software that does it, I've not seen any overlays that do it, any plugins that do it, things where if you're generating an AI image, can that image also then provide you with an alternative attribute that is somewhat meaningful if you're giving it the context of how that image is going to be used and provided in the page as well. But yeah, I think we're a long way off that yet.
Absolutely. It's going to be an interesting journey to see over the next 5-10 years, isn't it?
Definitely.
I think that's a good place to end
Yeah.
the podcast, William. Any final words or anything you want to add there?
No, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Welcome. You're absolutely welcome. I really enjoyed this episode. It's been really great to have these conversations. So to everyone listening, thank you for listening to the podcast. Or if you were watching it on YouTube, thank you for watching it. And till next time, we'll see you soon. So thank you very much. Bye.